Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Kentucky history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. Which locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. In 1903, the eastern Kentucky hills still harbored mysteries that modern medicine was unable to unravel. Meadowbrook Sanatorium was located 12 miles from Paris, Kentucky, amid the bucolic hills of Bourbon County. In 1887, the hospital was founded as a healing center for people with various blood and lung conditions, including consumption. Among the network of comparable organizations that dot the rural landscape of America at the turn of the century, its reputation was acceptable, if not exceptional. Meadowbrook is significant because of what was concealed beneath its limestone exterior for almost 50 years, not because of what was known about it at the time. Only in fragments did the story of identical twins Franklin and Frederick Blackwood, doctors who focused on experimental treatments for blood problems, come to light between 1949 and 1953, when the old sanatorium was finally dismantled to make room for an unbuilt veterans hospital. The first thing the demolition team found was a locked wing in the east section that could only be accessed by a secret passageway behind the administrative filing cabinets. There were therapy rooms within that were not like any other in the main building. The floor drains were worn, and the walls had strange stains that had soaked into the plaster. The most unsettling, however, were the ledgers that were discovered hidden in a desk drawer. These painstakingly maintained records detailed what the Blackwood brothers referred to as their circulation restoration protocol. Nobody could have predicted, when county officials were informed, how thorough the investigation would be, or how many layers of respectability would be lifted to expose the true events that transpired at Meadowbrook between 1901 and 1904. With flawless credentials and letters of recommendation from some of the most prominent East Coast medical schools, the twin physicians had traveled from Philadelphia. The sanatorium's board of trustees embraced them as creative young doctors whose cutting-edge techniques could give patients who had tried every available traditional treatment new hope. Nobody asked why such bright medical minds would decide to work in rural Kentucky instead of staying in the Northeast's medical hubs. The board just appreciated having them. It wasn't until much later that investigators learned the brothers had been quietly asked to leave their jobs at Pennsylvania Hospital after a number of patients complained of being weak and confused by strange therapy sessions. In almost every aspect, the Blackwood twins looked alike. Tall, slender men with sharply groomed dark beards and sharp gray eyes. They all wore identical black suits and spoke in the calm, professional voices that doctors are supposed to have. The fact that Dr. Franklin wore a gold pocket watch and Dr. Frederick favored a silver one was the only way the majority of staff could distinguish between them. They were known to trade watches from time to time, enjoying the uncertainty this caused, so even this distinction was not always accurate. Living together in a small home on the sanatorium grounds, they rarely interacted with other staff members and ate their meals in privacy. They were regarded as having an excellent, if rather fanatical, dedication to their work. While the rest of the sanatorium slept, they were frequently seen working through the night with their windows lit. Their eloquent explanations of blood composition and circulation, which were hypotheses at the time, impressed the medical director when they first presented their customized treatment program for patients with blood insufficiencies. Without hesitation, their desire for a private treatment area was fulfilled. Previously used for storage, the East Wing was refurbished in accordance with their requirements and given the name Blackwood Hematological Treatment Center. In a few months, the Blackwood brothers were receiving referrals from patients in neighboring counties for ailments ranging from anemia to more complicated blood diseases. In a number of situations that other doctors had judged hopeless, the medical community in Lexington and even Louisville noticed the better circumstances. In 1902, the brothers published a little paper in a local medical magazine explaining their strategy, deliberately leaving out particulars they said were still being worked out. The Blackwood approach encompassed far more than the traditional bloodletting and transfusion practices of the day, but no one outside their treatment rooms realized this. They had created a system that they thought would revive deteriorating blood through deliberate extraction, modification, and reintroduction based on the ledgers and equipment that were eventually retrieved. Martin Finch, a 47-year-old Lexington banker who had been diagnosed with pernicious anemia and was now bedridden and expected to die within months, was their first well-known case. Following 6 weeks of the Blackwood procedure, he resumed his job at the bank with a restored complexion and an apparent boost in vitality. His story became the brothers' trademark, brought up whenever they had to persuade a doubtful patient or relative. The fact that 4 other patients had received comparable care during the same time period, none of whom lived for more than 3 months following their release, was not noted in their public case files. Their deaths were not ascribed to the experimental operations they had undergone, but rather to the natural course of their illnesses. The Blackwood brothers developed stringent criteria for patient selection and significantly improved their technique by the end of 1902. They favored patients who were between the ages of 35 and 55 and who did not have close family members present throughout therapy. They created complex justifications for denying patients visitation during crucial protocol stages, arguing that outside emotional stimulation may upset the delicate equilibrium they were trying to establish in the blood. Their recorded preference for patients with complementary blood qualities, which they never fully explained in their published work, but which their private notes disclose, was the most disturbing. It involved choosing patient pairs whose blood they thought would interact in particular ways when processed and exchanged appropriately. At first, Dr. Horace Whitfield, the medical director of the Sanatorium, unquestioningly endorsed the brothers' efforts. Despite their unconventional procedures, they appeared to be effective, and they kept flawless records that survived his sporadic reviews. Whitfield didn't start to have concerns until the spring of 1903, when a visiting physician from Cincinnati questioned the abnormally high death rate among Blackwood patients who were discharged. The brothers respectfully but forcefully rejected his initial effort to watch a treatment session, claiming that the presence of another medical expert would betray the trust they had built with their patients. Citing his authority as medical director, he pressed the matter, and the brothers grudgingly consented to let him watch a preliminary examination the next week. Eleanor Simmons, a 39-year-old Frankfurt schoolteacher with an unidentified illness that caused intermittent weakness and fainting, was the planned patient. Whitfield's personal notebook, which his grandson found in 1952, describes the examination he saw as comprehensive but unremarkable. Standard tests of the time were performed by the brothers, who took her pulse at several locations on her body and looked at her eyes and skin tone. Whitfield was disturbed by what he felt rather than what he saw. A disturbing excitement in the brothers' demeanor when they learned that her condition was worse than first thought. They exchanged looks that conveyed more than just business interest. On Eleanor's chart, Frederick made a tiny mark that didn't match any of the then-standard medical notation when they thought Whitfield wasn't looking. After hours that evening, Whitfield went back to the East Wing and accessed the patient files using his master key. He became so troubled by what he discovered that he started a second, confidential log of the Blackwood patients and their results. He mentioned that another patient, 52-year-old farmer Robert Carver, who had a different blood type but comparable symptoms to Eleanor Simmons, had been partnered with her in the treatment plan. Whitfield examined every patient file from the Blackwood wing as a result of the revelation. The elderly doctor became alarmed when a trend became apparent. Every success story was paired with a patient who had allegedly passed away from their condition during the same course of treatment. Even more unsettling was the fact that many of the individuals who passed away had no past history of severe disease. They had been admitted for vague ailments, slight anemia, or exhaustion, which would normally not justify prolonged stays in a sanatorium. In a leather-bound journal he kept sealed in a chamber under his office floors, Whitfield started recording his observations. On April 17, 1903, he wrote, "I fear something unconscionable is occurring within these walls." The brothers speak of medical advancement, yet their methods bear more resemblance to the dark practices of centuries past than to modern science. I must proceed with caution, for if my suspicions prove correct, more lives than those already lost hang in the balance. Whitfield recorded patterns he considered troubling throughout the course of the following 2 months. In fact, patients were receiving treatment in pairs. Their treatments were planned so they would never meet, but they were kept in the dark about this arrangement. Even more concerning was the fact that one patient in each pair significantly improved while the other quickly deteriorated. Only 2 nurses, who had accompanied them from Philadelphia, provided assistance to the Blackwoods in the East Wing. Sisters Agnes and Martha, members of a Catholic nursing order, were renowned for their utmost discretion and steadfast devotion to the physicians. Whitfield was informed by a kitchen worker that the sisters had peculiar habits. It is unclear whether this last observation was influenced by superstition or reflected reality, but it added to the growing sense of unease surrounding the East Wing operations. They never ate in the staff dining room, kept their faces partially hidden by their habits, even in the warmest weather, and were occasionally heard speaking to each other in what the worker described as neither English nor any Christian language I've ever heard. They lived in tiny rooms next to the treatment wing and only interacted with other workers when required. When Nurse Agnes unexpectedly passed away in July 1903 from what was reportedly heart failure, a sister from the same order who was remarkably similar to the deceased nurse took her place in a matter of days. It appears that this new sister, Sister Maria, had received prior training in the Blackwood techniques because she fit right in with the operations. Even the circumstances surrounding Sister Agnes's death were questionable. According to the brothers, her religious order forbade an autopsy, thus one was not conducted. Only the brothers, Sister Martha, and a local priest who later acknowledged receiving an exceptionally large stipend for his brief services were present for her burial. Whitfield was informed by a groundskeeper, Thomas Leary, that he had been asked to dig the grave on the grounds of the sanatorium instead of in the municipal cemetery. Whitfield thought this was strange, but he complied with the request, explaining that it was the sisters' final request. What was more disturbing to him was that when they dropped the coffin into the earth, it seemed abnormally light. Dr. Whitfield gathered enough alarming data by August 1903 to write to the Kentucky State Medical Board asking for a formal investigation into the Blackwood practice. He presented his worries as issues that called for professional oversight rather than a criminal probe, outlining his views without directly accusing anyone. In order to prevent interception, he instructed his wife to mail the letter from Lexington rather than the local post office. His notebook, which documented ongoing digestive problems and inexplicable periods of disorientation, revealed that he had started to worry that his food was being tampered with. The medical board never received the letter. A carriage accident occurred on the rural road between Paris and the city, interrupting Mrs. Whitfield's journey to Lexington. Her handbag carrying the letter was lost in the creek where the carriage overturned, but she survived with just minor injuries. The driver claimed a fox had run across the road, scaring the horses, and the tragedy was declared accidental. The driver told Mrs. Whitfield that he had seen a black carriage following them for a few miles prior to the accident, but this information was left out of the official report. Only decades later, in her private letters to her sister, which were found in a trunk in her niece's attic in 1958, did this revelation come to light. After what appeared to be a stroke, Dr. Whitfield was discovered asleep in his office a week later. The Blackwood brothers took him under their care right away, after diagnosing a cerebral hemorrhage and recommending total seclusion in order to aid in his rehabilitation. He didn't regain consciousness and passed away 3 days later. According to a diary note he made, the day before he collapsed, he had a sneaking suspicion. I believe I am being watched. Frederick inquired today about my wife's trip to Lexington with unusual interest. Papers on my desk appear to have been disturbed when I returned to my office, even when locked. I have taken the precaution of making a second copy of my findings, which I have entrusted to Reverend Collins for safekeeping. They never located this second copy. 2 weeks following Whitfield's funeral, Reverend Collins, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Paris, passed away from pneumonia. Although the congregation minutes did not specify the nature of the business, church records show that he had been planned to travel to Louisville for church business. Frederick Blackwood was named interim medical director after the brothers grieved their colleague's passing in a fitting manner. They boosted the number of patients admitted to their program and enlarged their treatment wing with this new authority. The board of the sanatorium, impressed by the brothers' documented success rates and oblivious to the troubling trends Whitfield had pointed out, readily granted their demands for more supplies and equipment. At this time, the Blackwoods' fame spread outside of Kentucky. Positive evaluations of their techniques were published in medical journals as far away as Chicago and New York, primarily based on case studies that the brothers themselves supplied. They received an invitation to appear at a national conference on blood disorders that was set to take place in Baltimore in January 1904. Decades later, the medical director's widow, Eliza Whitfield's diary, revealed what transpired next. She grew to believe that her spouse had been purposefully suppressed after his death. In an attempt to find proof of misconduct, she worked as a kitchen worker at the sanatorium under a false identity, defying the advice of her friends and family. She spent 3 months observing the facility's routines, keeping track of which patients were brought to the East Wing and when supplies were delivered there. She became friends with a groundskeeper who reported witnessing odd deliveries late at night, special glass containers, and enormous amounts of ice that were bought from a Chicago medical supply company. Thomas Leary, the groundskeeper, served as her eyes in places she was unable to reach. For the East Wing, he said, the brothers had set up a separate waste disposal system, complete with a small incinerator that ran at odd hours. When he was called in to fix a leaky pipe in the treatment rooms, he saw walls lined with a kind of porcelain that is usually used in areas that need to be cleaned frequently, as well as floor drains that were noticeably bigger than those in other areas of the building. The most alarming were the noises he claimed to have heard late one evening while fixing a window close to the East Wing, a steady mechanical pumping, followed by what he called the sound of water being poured from one container to another, over and over again, Eliza discovered. Via close observation and the thoughtful positioning of tiny identifying marks on supply requisition forms, that the East Wing was using far more of some supplies than would be required for their stated patient count. Orders for specialty glass tubing, rubber hosing, and bulk supplies of chemicals, such as sodium citrate, which is known to inhibit blood coagulation, were particularly noteworthy. Her discovery of a secret dungeon that could only be accessed through the East Wing was the most unsettling. It had come up in Thomas's description of the drainage system he kept up at the sanatorium. He claimed that the cellar was always shut, and that the only people with keys were the Blackwood brothers. He had firmly been informed that the brothers would take care of any maintenance concerns themselves when he had asked for permission to inspect the drainage lines. Thomas was persuaded by Eliza to fabricate a story about a foundation leak in order to gain access to the cellar. Frederick Blackwood, to whom he addressed this concern directly, disregarded it but consented to conduct his own inspection. When Frederick unlocked the hefty door, Thomas, who had offered to help, was able to get a glimpse of the inside of the cellar. He was so troubled by what he witnessed that at first he wouldn't tell Eliza about it. "It reminded me of nothing so much as the inside of a clock," he told her. "But instead of gears and springs, the mechanisms were designed to move fluids through the system. And the fluid, ma'am," he had paused, visibly disturbed. "The fluid was red." However, he only reluctantly shared what he had seen after she pressed him, insisting it might have something to do with her husband's death. By November 1903, Eliza had accumulated enough proof, in her opinion, to go straight to the Board of Trustees. She created a thorough report by combining her observations, her husband's notes, and Thomas Leary's testimony. She gave this document to her sister in Paris to keep safe the night before the planned board meeting. The East Wing of Meadowbrook Sanatorium caught fire that same evening. The fire had spread to the main building by the time fire cars came from town. Newspaper reports state that the fire claimed the lives of 3 staff members and 14 patients. Both Blackwood brothers, who were allegedly trapped while trying to rescue patients, were among the deceased. The Paris Western Citizen newspaper reported on the event in dark terms. "A more terrible sight has seldom been witnessed in our peaceful county than the inferno that consumed Meadowbrook Sanatorium on the night of November 12th. The flames, visible for miles around, drew hundreds of onlookers who stood helpless as the conflagration devoured the once proud institution. Heroic efforts by staff and volunteers saved many, but tragically, the dedicated doctors, Blackwood, who had brought such hope to the afflicted, perished while attempting to rescue those in their care. An outpouring of compassion for the institution and its committed doctors who had lost their lives while performing their duties was inspired by the tragedy. Hundreds of people attended a mourning service in Paris, including former patients who said the brothers saved their lives. Attending this ceremony, Eliza Whitfield stood quietly in the rear of the church. She never showed the board her proof. Her diary said that the fire had done what she was unable to do. It had put a permanent stop to the brothers' work. "Perhaps justice comes in forms we do not choose," she said in her final article about the issue. "The truth of what happened in those rooms may have burned with them, but I cannot help but feel that some evils are best left buried in ashes." Although it was partially restored the following year, the sanatorium never recovered its previous standing. All associations with the Blackwood brothers had vanished from the public consciousness by 1915, when it was transformed into a hospital for tuberculosis patients. The East Wing Laboratory's equipment malfunction was determined to be the cause of the fire by the official investigation. This argument was easily accepted because the brothers' work was exploratory. Insurance claims were resolved with little investigation, and no criminal investigation was conducted. Few people were aware that, as workers dug through the debris in the days after the fire, a number of odd findings were found but never formally recorded. A maintenance worker discovered a partially melted metal device with copper fittings and glass tubes arranged in a circle that looked nothing like any medical equipment he had ever seen. Someone else found a strongbox filled with personal belongings that seemed to be from patients who had reportedly been released months before. The county coroner's report, which looked at the corpses found in the East Wing, was the most disturbing. He voiced uncertainty on the state of several remains in his private notes, which were subsequently discovered among his belongings after his passing. He couldn't explain the abnormalities seen in two corpses that were thought to be the Blackwood brothers. In particular, proof of facial surgery that seems to have been done just before they passed away. If it weren't for the 1,949 destruction and the intriguing findings it produced, the narrative may have been forgotten forever. Workers discovered a metal box with 3 leather-bound notebooks and a number of photographic plates among the East Wing's ruins, which were kept in an area between walls that had shielded it from the historic fire and later repairs. County officials were given the notebooks, but they soon recognized how unsettling their contents were and limited access. Permission was given to Dr. Lawrence Peabody, a medical historian at the University of Kentucky, to study them for a possible research paper. After 3 weeks with the materials, he withdrew from the project, citing ethical concerns about publicizing certain historical medical practices that might be misinterpreted by modern audiences. In a private letter to a colleague at Johns Hopkins, discovered after his death in 1964, Peabody described what he had found. "The Blackwood documents reveal a methodology so fundamentally at odds with medical ethics that I cannot in good conscience detail their contents for publication. What troubles me most is not the horror of what they did. History is unfortunately replete with such abuses in the name of science, but rather the cold precision with which they documented their work, and worse still, the underlying theory, which despite its moral abhorrence, contained certain principles that later proved valid in modern hematology." Peabody went on to explain that the brothers had developed theories about blood compatibility and circulation that anticipated discoveries not formally recognized until decades later. In contrast to their unethical practices, this scientific foresight created what he referred to as an ethical paradox that the medical profession is, perhaps, not yet prepared to confront. Sheriff William Calder's notes, which he took before sealing the documents in the county records, are the main source of information about the journal's contents. It's true that the Blackwood brothers' blood transfusion experiments went well beyond what was considered normal in their time. According to their theory, which was described in the journals, total circulatory replacement, a procedure that gradually substitutes essential fluid from a donor for a patient's weakened blood, could be used to treat several blood illnesses. According to their records, the donors were not volunteers, but rather unintentional participants who were chosen for their exceptional hematological profiles. They were kept sedated and exposed to progressive blood depletion while being admitted for planned, minor complaints or fabricated diagnoses. Before being given to the recipient, their removed blood was treated using a system they had designed that included heating, chilling, and the addition of proprietary solutions. In addition to treating the recipient's ailment, The brothers recorded their conviction that this procedure would create a sympathetic bond between donor and recipient that would allow the healthy donor's body to remotely regulate the recipient's blood production even after treatment ended. Sheriff Calder's notes include a disturbing excerpt directly from the sequel. Subject 17 continues to improve remarkably as Subject 18 declines. The sympathetic bond appears strongest when the subjects are maintained in close proximity without visual contact. We have positioned their beds in adjacent rooms, with the connecting wall housing our transfer apparatus. Subject 18 reports dreams of regained vitality and sensations of floating, while Subject 17 exhibits increased strength and improved blood composition, despite showing no conscious awareness of the source of his recovery. They describe the stages of decline with scientific detachment, noting changes in skin color, mental function, and vital signs, as these individuals were systematically drained to sustain their paired recipients. What they found most disturbing were the deteriorating donors, whom they clinically referred to as source vessels. The textual accounts were verified by the photographic plates that were discovered with the journals. They displayed the specialized tools the brothers had created, including copper tubing, glass jars, and precisely calibrated pumping mechanisms that made it possible to harvest, process, and transfuse blood between patients in a regulated manner. Numerous pictures showed treatment rooms with 2 beds set up in parallel, joined by this complex network of reservoirs and tubing. One image, which Peabody and Calder both detailed in great detail but which was never made public, looked to depict a treatment in progress. On nearby tables lay 2 patients, one pale and sunken, the other clearly strong and developing color. The equipment, which consisted of glass tubes containing dark fluid at different processing phases, stood between them. One of the Blackwood brothers, who could not be identified, stood in the middle of the picture, keeping an eye on the flow, with what Peabody called the detached fascination of a man observing an interesting natural phenomenon, rather than orchestrating a human tragedy. It's unknown what became of these records following Sheriff Calder's review. They were handed to federal authorities in 1953, according to county archives, but inquiries to the FBI and National Archives have not confirmed that they ever reached their destination. The most widely accepted explanation is that they were purposefully destroyed to stop others from copying the brothers' techniques. In the years since, numerous scholars have endeavored to piece together the complete narrative of the Blackwood brothers. Based on interviews with former Meadowbrook employees and patients' families, journalist Michael Harrington wrote a number of articles for the Louisville Courier-Journal in 1961. His research showed that the brothers' reported achievements were mostly made up. The majority of their cured patients passed dead within 6 months of being released, frequently as a result of unexpected hemorrhagic episodes or inexplicable relapses. Additionally, Harrington discovered previously undisclosed details regarding the brothers' past. Although they had received respectable medical training, their early career had been tainted by scandal. They had carried out illegal experiments on patients in the charity ward at Pennsylvania Hospital who had little legal protection from strange treatments due to their socioeconomic standing. Harrington was informed by a hospital orderly who had collaborated with the brothers in Philadelphia that they had been captivated by conjoined twin cases, especially those involving blood vessel sharing. Their theory, which seemed to serve as the basis for their further research, was that the stronger twin frequently provided assistance to the weaker one through shared circulation. His conversation with Catherine Leary, the daughter of the groundskeeper who had helped Eliza Whitfield, was possibly the most terrifying. Catherine says her father insisted the sanatorium fire was not the tragedy it seemed to be until his death in 1940. Thomas Leary had been making his last rounds the night of the fire when he saw strange activity in the East Wing courtyard. A carriage was being loaded with multiple trunks by the Blackwood brothers and their nursing assistants. The fire started less than an hour after they saw him observing, and Dr. Frederick came over and placed a gold coin in his palm, saying just, "You've seen nothing tonight, Thomas. For your family's sake, remember that." As the main structure was consumed, Thomas, who was assisting with evacuation attempts, reported seeing 2 individuals that looked like the brothers leaving through the rear service road. Fearing for his family's safety, he never made this observation public, but years later, he told his daughter the story. Catherine also disclosed that her father had been certain they were being monitored for a few weeks following the fire. In Paris, strange persons had been spotted inquiring about the sanatorium employees. Even proof that their house had been examined while they were at church was discovered by the family. The silver coin, which felt like a warning and a message, replaced the gold one that had been presented to her father, which had vanished from its hiding spot under a floorboard. According to Harrington's inquiry, 2 individuals who fit the brothers' description had bought tickets for a steamship that was leaving New York the week after the fire and was headed for Liverpool. Dr. Thomas Wells and Dr. Henry Wells, doctors returning to England from an American study voyage, were featured on the passenger manifest. The Wells brothers were carrying medical specimens in specialized containers that required careful handling and refrigeration during the voyage. The ship's log mentioned that they had paid a significant amount to guarantee that these specimens were kept at the right temperature during the crossing, which was an odd detail in the manifest. If the brothers did survive, we don't know what happened to them. There are no records of doctors with the Blackwood or Wells names opening practices in England during that time period in British medical registry. Nonetheless, a researcher by the name of Richard Keller found mentions of novel blood treatment procedures being created at a private clinic in Geneva by anonymous American doctors in Swiss medical periodicals published between 1906 and 1909. These protocols' descriptions are quite similar to those of the Blackwood techniques, albeit with improvements that fix some of the earlier approach's fatal defects. After an investigation by the local medical authorities, the clinic reportedly closed unexpectedly after operating for around 3 years. Official Swiss archives do not include any records of its practitioners or patients. When building workers discovered a sealed cistern not listed in any of the property plans while excavating for a shopping center close to the former sanatorium site in 1967, the last piece of the Blackwood puzzle came to light. Dozens of different-sized sealed glass containers were inside. The contents were determined by the Kentucky State Police Laboratory to be human tissue and blood preserved in a formaldehyde and other chemical solution. The majority of these containers had labels that just had numbers, that didn't match any known record system. 7 larger vessels, on the other hand, had full names that matched patients who had reportedly perished in the 1903 fire. The inquiry was briefly reopened as a result of this revelation, but it was once more closed because the main suspects had either died or vanished decades prior, and the majority of the witnesses had long since passed away. The remains were buried properly in the Paris cemetery in an unmarked grave with the simple inscription, Meadowbrook, 1903. The fact that the construction workers also discovered a sealed copper tube with a handwritten document inside that was partially readable but badly ruined by dampness was not widely publicized. It seemed to be a letter to future practitioners of the art, outlining an improved Blackwood technique that allegedly avoided the necessity for total donor depletion while still accomplishing the intended sympathetic bond between circulatory systems. Despite thorough searches of the area, no such landmark was identified, and no other documents were ever found, despite the letter's reference to additional documentation buried at another place, which was only described as where the waters meet beneath the Twin Oaks. There is more to the Blackwood brothers' tale than a gruesome period in Kentucky's medical past. It serves as a sobering reminder of how easily respectability and power can conceal the worst of motives, and how easily weaker individuals can be taken advantage of in the name of advancement and recovery. The case is especially unsettling because of the brothers' deliberate actions. These were systematic processes that were honed over years and meticulously recorded with scientific accuracy, not rash acts of insanity. Their journals show men who truly valued their research and who viewed their donors as essential parts of a major medical discovery rather than as victims. In a passage that Sheriff Calder transcribed, Frederick, or Franklin Blackwood, said, "The advancement of medical science has always required sacrifice. From the anatomists of old who required cadavers to study, to the modern surgeon who must accept certain casualties to perfect his technique, progress demands its tribute in suffering. We merely systematize this necessary exchange, ensuring that each sacrifice yields maximum benefit. Is it not more ethical to deliberately select and manage these sacrifices than to leave them to chance, as conventional medicine does? This ruthless justification exposes the brothers as something possibly more troubling than laughing villains, men who had so fully persuaded themselves of the morality of their cause that morality was no longer a factor, but only a technological challenge to be solved. Their near legitimization is perhaps the most concerning aspect. If Eliza hadn't followed up on her investigation, if Dr. Whitfield hadn't grown skeptical, and if their work hadn't been abruptly stopped by the fire, the Blackwood technique may have been more widely accepted. The fire happened just months before the brothers were scheduled to discuss their findings at a regional medical conference. Blood transfusion science evolved along more moral lines in the decades after the Meadowbrook tragedies, ultimately resulting in the secure and voluntary donation systems that we are familiar with today. However, the Blackwood approach's legacy persisted in medical circles as a warning story, rarely discussed in public but sometimes brought up in ethics debates. Dr. Jonathan Morris, who was a member of the American Medical Association Ethics Committee in the 1952nd, wrote in a private memo, "The Blackwood case, while extreme, illustrates the essential tension at the heart of medical research, the balance between advancing knowledge and protecting individual rights. What makes their story particularly valuable as a teaching tool is that their scientific insights were not without merit. Indeed, some of their observations about blood compatibility predated official discoveries by decades. This forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that unethical research can sometimes yield valid scientific results, which in turn presents the medical community with complex questions about how to handle such knowledge. The location of the former Meadowbrook Sanatorium is still undeveloped. Due to unanticipated site issues, investors withdrew their backing from the shopping center project that revealed the cistern. Many locals avoid the region completely, especially after dark, because they say the plants grow weirdly there, either too vigorously or not at all. On calm evenings, some people say they can hear a steady pumping that sounds like it comes from the ground, followed by the soft splash of liquid being poured from one container to another. Others write these tales off as cliched folklore that invariably clings to such places. The peculiar soil composition in the vicinity of the former East Wing is a phenomenon that can be explained by science. Geologists from the University of Kentucky conducted an analysis in 1972 that found trace quantities of compounds similar to those employed in early blood preservation methods, as well as significant concentrations of iron. Years of inappropriate medical waste disposal most certainly led to this contamination, leaving an environmental legacy that outlasted the hospital. The medical records of individuals who survived the brothers' treatments cannot be disregarded. Between 1910 and 1915, Dr. Lawrence Carson of Lexington collected follow-up cases that revealed unsettling trends among former Blackwood patients. Many described symptoms that were exactly the same as those of their unidentified donors, ailments they had never experienced before and for which there was no known medical cause. According to Carson's records, William Townsend, who had successfully undergone the Blackwood treatment for anemia in 1902, started to have episodes of unexplained weakness at precisely 3:15 p.m., the same time his unidentified donor had allegedly taken sedatives during their shared treatment period. For years, this time connection remained, progressively losing its intensity but never completely vanishing. After receiving treatment for a blood disorder in early 1903, another patient, Josephine Mercer, started painting landscapes of a coastal village she had never been to. Her family was able to figure out that the village was a small fishing community outside of Boston, which was the hometown of another patient who had been at Meadowbrook at the same time but had reportedly passed away from complications. It was more disturbing when recipients related personal histories of people they had never met or shared memories of places they had never been to. Many described having frequent dreams in which they lay in a dark room, watching their own blood flow through glass tubes to an invisible receiver, feeling weaker and weaker. Carson never had his study published. Carson concluded that something more than blood had been transferred between these individuals, something science has yet to identify or understand. Among his papers was correspondence with a doctor, Heinrich Weber of Vienna, a pioneer in early psychological research, which was found in his notes after his death in 1928. The idea that some memories and experiences may be kept not just in the brain but also in the body's cellular structure, especially in the blood, was the basis of Weber's physical memory theory. He proposed that the Blackwood cases might serve as unintentional evidence for his theory, demonstrating how memories could be passed from one person to another through significant blood transfusions. As the decades went by, people's awareness of the Blackwood case diminished. Medical historians mostly recognized it by the 1,960 seconds as an illustration of unethical testing during the pre-regulation period. The tangible proof, such as the journals, tools, and pictures, had vanished into private or public archives. Every now and then, unanticipated tangential ties to the case would emerge. An old patient who claimed to have been a nurse at Meadowbrook Sanatorium was treated by a Toronto doctor in 1954. She repeatedly described a process of separation of life essence from carrier fluid during episodes of delirium prior to her death. And she pleaded for forgiveness for her involvement in what she referred to as the harvesting. She spoke of twin doctors who could exchange identities at will and patients whose strength flowed from one to another through glass rivers. It is impossible to know whether her testimony was based on real memories or the confused imagination of a failing mind. The final known direct link to the case was broken in 1968 when Margaret Simmons, the daughter of Eleanor Simmons, the schoolteacher Dr. Whitfield had examined, passed away. Margaret had spent years investigating the circumstances surrounding her mother's death, gathering documents and testimonies into what she referred to as the Blackwood File. This collection was allegedly given to the Kentucky Historical Society following her passing, but when people ask where it is, they are told that there isn't a file of that name in their catalog. Another unresolved issue in the Blackwood case is whether it was lost, purposefully taken out, or never came. Speaking on condition of anonymity to the Lexington Herald-Leader in 1975, a former archivist at the Society said he saw the file for a short time before men posing as representatives of a federal health agency took it away. Among other things, she said, it included a set of correspondence between Eleanor Simmons and Robert Carver, the farmer she had been partnered with during the Blackwood Protocol. Despite living in different counties, these letters, which were written after both had been released from Meadowbrook, detailed odd symptoms they had been having at the same time. Carver's story of instantly grasping French terms that Eleanor used in her letters, a language he had never studied but that she had taught for years, was the most noteworthy. The remnants that remain now include newspaper clippings, passages from diaries, first-hand recollections, and the enduring rumors that continue to be spread across Bourbon County. The final tangible remnant of what once happened there is the East Wing's limestone foundation, which is only slightly visible as a depression in the overgrown field. James Thornton, a local historian who has researched the case in great detail, thinks that some of the relics from Meadowbrook might have been purposefully dispersed to keep anyone from piecing together the whole tale. Every few years, he stated to the Paris Western Citizen in 1981, something turns up in an attic or basement, a photograph, a letter, once even a piece of glass tubing that matched descriptions of the Blackwood apparatus. But these pieces never come together to form a complete picture. It's as though someone wanted the story remembered, but not fully understood. A pocket watch that a retired nurse named Helen Crawford claimed had belonged to one of the Blackwood brothers was given to the Bourbon County Historical Society in 1977. There were no distinguishing signs on the gold watch, but for a little etching within the case that said, "Time flows like blood, constant, yet never the same." The watch was briefly on show until the Society took it out of its exhibit cabinet. There were no reports of theft, and the item's receipt is no longer mentioned in museum archives. Some medical researchers view the Blackwood case as an example of a transfusion science approach that has not yet been adopted, one that was created ahead of its time and is being pursued unethically. Others see it as a reminder of the darker periods of medicine, when the distinction between harm and healing was perilously hazy. The Blackwood brothers occupy an uncomfortable position in medical history. Simultaneously, monsters and visionaries, their understanding of blood compatibility factors predated mainstream acceptance by decades, yet their methods violated every principle of patient autonomy and non-maleficence. Dr. Victor Ramirez, a hematologist, reviewed the case's available information for a 1,983 article in the Journal of Medical Ethics. The case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Scientific insight and moral depravity can coexist in the same minds. We may never know the entire scope of what transpired at Meadowbrook. The case's facts have been scattered and diluted with time, much like the blood that passed through the brothers' equipment. What's left is a tale that still frightens those who hear it, a warning that often the most terrifying creatures are those who talk authoritatively, dress respectably, and make claims to cure our illnesses. No definitive judgment has been made by history regarding the Blackwood brothers themselves. Did they flee to carry on their work elsewhere, or were they destroyed by the fire as stated in the official report? Sometimes, when rare case studies from the early 20th century are discovered in medical archives, the question comes up again. In isolated places ranging from South America to Eastern Europe, there were reports of experimental blood therapies. These usually involved twin doctors, whose names were never exactly the same, but whose techniques were uncannily identical to those created at Meadowbrook. In 1959, a historian studying early Soviet medical procedures found a particularly interesting lead: references to American advisors who had helped create a specialist treatment facility near Kazan in 1908. Operating until the 1917 revolution, the facility focused on blood disorders and used techniques characterized as innovative and controversial. Official records only name the consultants as the American Brothers, but staff reports called them the Mirror Doctors, a reference to identical twins. Robert Hendricks, a hobbyist researcher, came to believe in 1962 that the Blackwood brothers had not only lived, but had carried on with their work under other aliases throughout the early 20th century. Throughout Europe, South America, and eventually East Asia, he identified a pattern of similar medical procedures that appeared and vanished. These operations always followed the same pattern. A specialized clinic was established in a remote area. Reports of miraculous recoveries were made. Patient mortality concerns eventually surfaced. The clinic was abruptly closed, and then another facility of a similar nature appeared. The Immortal Twins, the global legacy of the Blackwood brothers. A manuscript that Hendricks sent to multiple publishers in 1964 summarized his research. All dismissed it as speculative and potentially libelous. Hendricks' study notes were allegedly destroyed, and he passed away in a house fire the following year. Those who have examined the Blackwood case continue to speculate as to whether this was an unfortunate coincidence or something more nefarious. Maybe some questions should stay unanswered, some doors should stay closed, and some knowledge should remain dormant. The ethical issues brought up by the Blackwood case still have relevance in contemporary medicine, as stated in Eliza Whitfield's last journal post on the brothers. Some pursuits of knowledge carry too high a price, not just for those who serve as its unwilling vessels, but for humanity itself. One of the primary issues in research ethics is the conflict between expanding medical knowledge and defending individual rights. The brothers' ruthless calculation that some must be sacrificed in order to save others is an extreme kind of utilitarian reasoning that continues to surface in discussions around the distribution of resources and experimental therapies. The way they chronicled it, with a clinical detachment that viewed human pain as merely data to be recorded, is what makes their case especially troubling to contemporary medical ethicists. According to the parts of their journals that have been recounted by those who have studied them, their patients are not acknowledged as having inherent worth or rights. They were only subjects, vessels, or specimens, words that devalued sentient, living people to the level of inanimate objects used in experiments. This dehumanization exemplifies what philosopher Edmund Stillman referred to as the fundamental corruption of medical practice, which occurs when a doctor views the patient as nothing more than a problem to be researched or a case to be resolved. The Blackwood case was identified by Stillman in his 1972 examination of past medical abuses as perhaps the purest example of how scientific curiosity, unchecked by ethical constraint, transforms healing into harm. Bourbon County's undulating hills today bear no resemblance to the atrocities that took place there more than a century ago. Only those who know exactly where and how to look can see the faint remnants of Meadowbrook Sanatorium, which have faded like an old bloodstain. The Blackwood journals, however, might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered, possibly in a private collection or a government archive. Their content still has the power to cast a long shadow over our knowledge of medical history and the extent to which unbridled curiosity may drive human nature. There are still local legends. Some say that on some autumn evenings, when the moon is long in shadow and the mist rises from the hollows, the sound of mechanical pumping, a steady pulse that seems to come from the earth itself, is audible, followed by the soft splash of liquid being poured from one container to another. Some claim to have seen twin people in antiquated medical uniforms strolling around the area where the East Wing used to be, their shapes just discernible from a distance and vanishing from close inspection. Naturally, these are the customary adornments that any sordid past gradually amasses. Even more concerning are the sporadic accounts from nearby physicians about individuals displaying strange symptoms, especially senior citizens who were in the vicinity when the sanatorium was in operation. Some claim to have memories of treatments they never had, or to have had dreams in which they were in treatment rooms they had never seen. Several of these cases were reported by Dr. Elaine Patterson, who worked in geriatric medicine in Paris from 1972 until her retirement in 1995. I had at least 5 patients over the years who described identical nightmares involving glass tubes and the sensation of their blood being drawn out, she said in an interview from 1997. Patterson speculated that they might be suppressed childhood memories, but none had any known connection to each other or to the old sanatorium. Yet their descriptions matched details of the Blackwood procedures that weren't publicly known. These people might have heard descriptions that stuck in their mind, or visited the sanatorium. She also thought that dream images might have been influenced by local mythology regarding the brothers. She preferred logical answers over supernatural ones, rejecting more fantastical ones such location memories or psychic imprints. However, these accounts' tenacity and consistency across people who don't seem to be related adds yet another level of mystery to the Blackwood legacy. Could horrific experiences possibly leave their mark on a place, producing echoes that sensitive people might notice decades later? Or does the explanation come from the ability of local history to permeate society and manifest itself in imagination and dreams? In 1985, medical historian Dr. Caroline Shepard was awarded a grant to gather and examine all of the information that was available, marking the final known attempt to carry out a comprehensive inquiry of the Blackwood case. During the course of her 3-year investigation, she examined local records, spoke with the relatives of patients and staff, and used the Freedom of Information Act to gain access to government papers that were sealed. The most thorough examination of the case to date may be found in her subsequent book, Blood Science and Boundary Transgression, The Meadowbrook Sanatorium Case, which was released in 1,989 inches, a limited academic edition. Even Shepard, however, recognized the significant holes in the record. What strikes me most forcefully about this case, she said in her conclusion, is not just the horror of what occurred, but how effectively knowledge of it has been fragmented and obscured, whether through deliberate suppression or the natural erosion of historical memory. The full truth of what happened at Meadowbrook has been rendered impossible to reconstruct with certainty. However, the physical evidence she documented, the altered architecture of the East Wing, the specialized equipment recovered from the site, the chemical analysis of soil samples, and most importantly, the statistical anomalies in patient outcomes all point to something far outside of standard medical practice that took place at Meadowbrook under the Blackwoods' direction. Medical historian Richard Barnes dismissed much of her research as giving scholarly attention to what amounts to a regional ghost story, embellished over time and distorted through repeated telling. Shadows and ideas remain, fragments that never quite come together to create a whole picture. Some people criticized Shepard's work for giving too much weight to what critics perceived as inflated tales and local superstition. Think about what mysteries might still be within an abandoned hospital or sanatorium from a bygone age the next time you pass one. What treatments were performed in the name of healing? What theories were tested on the weak? What knowledge was acquired and then purposefully lost? The most horrifying thing about the Blackwood case, as with so many others, is not that such things have happened in the past, but rather that the evidence of them is being methodically removed from our collective consciousness, leaving only warnings and whispers. The last word on the Blackwood brothers perhaps belongs to Dr. Lawrence Peabody, who shortly before his death added a final note to his unpublished analysis of their work. What troubles me most about the Blackwood case is not what they did. Human history is unfortunately replete with such atrocities, but rather what their story reveals about how easily the medical establishment can be deceived, how readily we accept innovation without questioning its human cost, and how comfortably we forget what should be forgotten. The brothers are long dead, but the conditions that allowed them to operate persist. Our collective willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths, our deference to authority figures, and our eternal hope that salvation might come without sacrifice. That hope, that we might heal without harm, advance without abandoning our humanity, represents the fundamental ethical challenge, not just of medicine, but of all scientific progress. The Blackwood brothers chose one path. The question that lingers over their story is whether we, collectively and individually, would recognize and reject such a path today. For while the brothers themselves have passed into history, the fundamental temptation they embodied remains, the allure of knowledge and advancement, even at the cost of our humanity. Their legacy serves as a reminder that the most important medical ethic is not first, do no harm, but rather first, remember that your patient is human. You may pass the unmarked field where Meadowbrook once stood while driving through Bourbon County's undulating hills today and never be aware of its past. The location is not marked by a historical marker. Those who suffered there are not remembered by any memorial. Like so many painful periods in the history of medicine, the story has been allowed to fade. However, the echoes continue to reverberate in local folklore and family histories, libraries, and archives, as well as in the nightmares of sensitive people who have never heard the Blackwood name. Because some stories just won't go away. Not all memories can be erased. If only we have the guts to pay attention. Some warnings still ring true across the years.